The digital clock on my polished oak desk ticked toward the end of the workday, the thin red line of the second hand slicing through minutes that were already heavy with unspoken consequence. Outside my window, the city glowed faintly, skyscrapers catching the dying sunlight like the edges of sharpened steel. But inside my office, the air was deliberate, still poised for the moment I had been preparing. At 4:52 p.m., I pressed send on an email whose wording I had rehearsed as carefully as any strategist preparing for a campaign. Kevin, please see me in my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. to discuss a matter of workplace conduct. Miss Thorne. 11 words, each chosen with surgical precision, not one more than necessary. To the untrained eye, it was just a routine message, professional and restrained, but I knew its effect would extend far beyond its digital delivery. Words, when deployed correctly, linger in the mind like shadows at the edge of vision, and Kevin Myers, whose conscience already trembled with unease, would spend the night revisiting those lines until they carved doubt into his very marrow. My intention was not cruelty, but correction, for in human resources, though the name sounds bloodless, bureaucratic, detached, our task is not merely to enforce rules, but to sculpt behavior, to balance the precarious line between what is tolerated and what corrodes the delicate fabric of trust on which any corporate body depends. Kevin was not a villain, not even an instigator in the theatrical sense. His missteps were subtler, almost invisible at first glance, but patterns of invisibility can be more dangerous than bold offenses. He drifted through innovate solutions like a muted note in a bright melody, easily forgotten, rarely challenged, but always present. His work was competent, though uninspired, his manner courteous, though tentative, his contributions just enough to meet expectations without ever exceeding them. Yet under the surface of this quiet adequacy, something persistent gnawed. A way his eyes lingered just too long, the unspoken weight of his gaze unsettling female colleagues who otherwise excelled in their tasks. There were no formal complaints, no incidents that could be captured neatly in the cold language of policy violation, but whispers travel faster than written reports, and whispers are often the first signs of flames smoldering beneath an office's polished veneer. The reports had reached me gradually, often in hesitant tones. It just feels uncomfortable. I can't explain it, but he stares a little too long. These phrases, seemingly small, carried immense gravity, for discomfort is not quantifiable in policy handbooks, yet corrodes morale more effectively than any scandal. And so I watched Kevin discreetly, training my perception on his interactions during team meetings, during break-room exchanges, during the moments when he thought no one noticed. I confirmed what intuition had suggested. His gaze often strayed, and though he likely considered it harmless, harmlessness is not judged by intention but by impact. My responsibility was to intervene before the quiet unease coalesced into formal complaint or legal issue. But more than that, I wanted to address the root, a lack of empathy, a failure to perceive how one's smallest behaviors ripple outward into the shared environment. When the appointed hour arrived the next morning, I did not need a clock to know it was precisely 10. The knock at my door was so tentative it could have been mistaken for a passing vibration in the walls, yet it carried the weight of dread. Fear has a sound, and I heard it then, 3 taps of hesitation that echoed louder than any confident rap of knuckles. I called, "Come in," with a voice trained to balance invitation and command, a tone that neither threatened nor indulged, but allowed the hearer to sense the stakes without being told. Kevin entered with the energy of a man trying to make himself smaller than his frame would allow. His suit was ill-fitting, the polyester fabric creased in places where confidence might have smoothed it, and his mustard yellow tie was knotted poorly, sagging as though unwilling to bear its small burden. These external details may seem superficial, but they are never irrelevant. For in the architecture of workplace perception, presentation is both scaffolding and signal. To wear a suit carelessly is to declare, however unconsciously, that one has not mastered the codes of belonging. He perched at the edge of the guest chair, as though the cushion burned, and his eyes darted from the certificates lining my wall to the abstract art, to the expansive skyline, anywhere but to my face. His hands worried a pen until it bent dangerously in his grip. "Mr. Myers, Kevin," I began, adjusting the register of formality with deliberate calculation. Names, like tools, can be sharpened or dulled depending on how they are handled. I motioned toward the chair. "Please, sit." My office, a study in both comfort and authority, had been arranged for precisely such encounters. The heavy mahogany desk that divided us was not merely furniture, but a stage set, a reminder of the hierarchy between us. The guest chair was designed to cushion, without relaxing, a space of temporary negotiation rather than residence. Behind me, sunlight streamed across bookshelves filled with volumes on leadership, ethics, and psychology, their spines silently reinforcing the legitimacy of my approach. He lowered himself as though gravity resisted him. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice thin and almost apologetic. I smiled with a gentleness that could have been mistaken for kindness, but was in fact calibration, the application of warmth sufficient to keep the subject engaged without erasing the weight of the meeting. "Kevin, thank you for being punctual," I said. "I'd like to have a frank and, I hope, constructive conversation." Then I let silence bloom. Silence is not emptiness. It is a crucible in which nerves are tested. The seconds stretched until Kevin began to fidget, his knee bouncing lightly, his throat working as though words might surface. Only then did I proceed. "It has come to my attention," I began, carefully framing each phrase, "that certain aspects of your behavior have caused discomfort among your colleagues." His head snapped upward, alarm flooding his face, and for the first time his gaze locked with mine. I don't understand," he stammered. "I always try to be respectful." I held his eyes steadily, my voice calm, almost soothing, but underpinned by steel. "I believe that you intend no harm, Kevin, but intention is not the measure here. In a professional environment, perception is reality. The perception shared quietly by several colleagues is that your gaze lingers, not in overt ways, not enough to be named outright, but enough to create unease. That unease matters." A flush crept up his neck, red rising like a tide against his pale skin. His protest began, fragmented, defensive, denying that he meant anything improper. Yet his words fell apart under their own weakness. I leaned forward slightly, the subtle sound of my chair adjusting, punctuating the air like a gavel. "Even now, Kevin, as we discuss this very issue, I've observed your eyes flicker downward more than once. That is precisely the kind of unconscious behavior we are addressing." He froze, shame painting itself visibly across his features. His pen bent further in his grip. But shame, though powerful, is not transformation. What Kevin needed was more than awareness. He required perspective. I knew that lectures alone, however well-intentioned, rarely uproot habits. To alter perception, one must offer a different lens entirely. "You see," I continued, shifting from accusation to explanation, "at Innovate Solutions, we emphasize empathy. True learning does not come from being told, but from experiencing the world as others do. That is why, long ago, our company adopted a rarely remembered policy, an experiential attire exercise. It requires that employees, regardless of role, occasionally participate in temporary adjustments designed to foster understanding of perspectives different from their own." Kevin blinked, incredulous, as though he had misheard. "You mean, I have to—" I raised a hand gently, cutting off his panic. You have to participate to understand, to walk a day not in your own familiar patterns, but in a role that will illuminate what it feels like to be observed, scrutinized, or judged in ways you may never have noticed. This is not punishment, Kevin. It is education, and it begins today. I stood then, the quiet authority of the gesture filling the room more than any raised voice could have. From a polished cabinet, I withdrew a sleek black box, its exterior simple yet deliberate, the kind of packaging reserved for official company training kits. I placed it before him on the desk. He looked at it as though it might detonate. His fingers, still trembling, reached for the lid, and within that box lay not only fabric and instruction, but the beginning of a process that would test him, reshape him, and perhaps redeem him, if he could endure what came next. Kevin's fingers hovered uncertainly over the box, as if its weight were more than physical, as if it contained not cloth or object, but a mirror he was afraid to look into. The pause stretched long enough for the silence to thicken, and I watched him wrestle with invisible hands of hesitation. Finally, with a breath that trembled, he opened it. Inside lay what at first glance seemed innocuous, a set of garments neatly folded, their lines sharp with professionalism, but softened by details that immediately marked them as belonging to a different category than what Kevin had ever worn. A tailored skirt of navy blue, a blouse with a subtle sheen, stockings folded like pressed parchment, and shoes that gleamed with a polish too deliberate to be dismissed as casual. Alongside them sat a manual, slim yet imposing, its cover embossed with the company's crest and the words, Empathy Attire Initiative. Kevin's throat worked soundlessly as his eyes darted from the contents back to my face, searching for reprieve that was not forthcoming. His protest hovered unsaid in the air, and I gave him the grace of waiting, for it is often in the waiting that a subject reveals more than in speech. When at last he spoke, his voice was thin, half-broken. This isn't serious. You can't possibly mean—" "I mean exactly what is written," I replied evenly, each word measured as though etched in steel. This exercise has existed within company policy for over a decade, though rarely enforced. It is not punitive, Kevin. It is experiential. You have been selected because the subtlety of your conduct requires subtle correction. Policy can be memorized. Empathy must be felt. Nay, his hands curled into fists on his knees. The pen he had bent earlier now lay abandoned on the desk, its form a casualty of his resistance. He looked down again, eyes slipping away from mine, as if in spite of himself, and I let the silence hang, waiting for him to confront the very instinct that had brought him here. At last I leaned forward, lowering my voice to something softer yet more inexorable. The choice, Kevin, is not whether you participate. It is whether you learn. He swallowed hard, and when he finally nodded, it was not in agreement, but in surrender. I rose smoothly, motioning toward the adjoining private consultation room, designed precisely for moments of transition. Its walls were a muted cream, its furnishings minimal, its purpose not comfort, but reflection. On the small table inside, a mirror stood upright, framed in black steel, tall enough to force a participant to confront their entire posture rather than fragments. I gestured for him to step inside, carrying the box as though it contained chains. When the door closed behind him, I remained outside, giving him privacy but not absolution. Transformation, even symbolic, requires confrontation with one's own reflection, and that confrontation is not eased by the presence of others. Through the frosted glass, I could see only blurred movements, hesitant shapes of a man stepping reluctantly out of his old armor and into attire designed not to humiliate, but to transpose perspective. Minutes stretched long, punctuated by muffled sounds of fabric shifting, shoes settling, breath hitching. At last, the handle turned, and Kevin emerged. He was the same man, yet not. The navy skirt fell just above his knees, his posture awkward and unaccustomed, the blouse soft where his usual shirts were stiff. The shoes, modest heels, altered his balance subtly, forcing each step into a different cadence. His expression was taut with embarrassment, but beneath it flickered something deeper, a raw vulnerability, the kind that arises when one's practiced defenses are stripped away. I let my gaze linger not on him, but through him, as though seeing the effect rather than the costume. "How do you feel?" I asked gently, though I already knew the answer. "I feel exposed," he admitted after a pause, the word escaping with reluctant honesty. "Good," I replied, folding my hands atop the desk. "That is the point. Exposure is the daily reality for many of your colleagues. Every glance, every evaluation, every subtle gesture carries with it the weight of scrutiny. For them, this is not a costume, it is life. You are not here to mimic them, Kevin. You are here to understand." He lowered himself back into the guest chair, though now the act carried a different awkwardness, as if he were negotiating not only the seat, but the very terms of his identity. His hands fumbled with the hem of the skirt, tugging it nervously, a gesture I had seen mirrored countless times by women in boardrooms forced to balance professionalism with constant vigilance against being diminished. And now Kevin, in this temporary skin, could not escape the same impulse. "Today," I continued, my tone steady, "you will proceed with your work as usual. Meetings, interactions, assignments, all of them. But you will do so in this attire. You will not hide, you will not excuse, you will not retreat. You will engage as though nothing is different, and you will observe keenly how everything is." His eyes widened in alarm. "In front of everyone?" "Yes," I said simply. "Empathy is not forged in private mirrors, Kevin. It is tested in public spaces. The discomfort you feel now is but a shadow of what others navigate daily without acknowledgement. This is your lesson, and it begins immediately." He tried to speak again, to argue, but the words tangled. Finally he exhaled, long and uneven, and nodded. I escorted him to the elevator. The descent was silent save for the soft click of his unfamiliar shoes on the marble floor, a sound that punctuated his discomfort with every step. When the doors opened onto the main office floor, the atmosphere shifted as naturally as breath. Conversations faltered, eyes flicked up from screens, surprise darted like current across the open-plan space. And there, in that suspended moment, Kevin felt what it was to be seen not as he chose, but as others judged. His colleagues' reactions were varied. Some masked curiosity behind polite professionalism. Others exchanged brief glances that spoke volumes. No one laughed, no one spoke aloud, but the silence itself became a chorus, and Kevin walked through it as though each note pressed upon him. He settled at his desk, his movement stiff, his focus fractured. I observed discreetly from a distance, not to revel in his discomfort, but to ensure the exercise did what policy alone could not. Throughout the day, I noted subtle shifts. When he rose for coffee, he tugged unconsciously at the skirt's hem. When he leaned over a document, he became suddenly aware of posture and angles he had never before considered. During a meeting, he faltered under the weight of glances that may have been neutral yet felt sharp, and for once his own eyes did not wander. They remained anchored, cautious, respectful, tempered by awareness. This was not humiliation. This was revelation. As the hours passed, Kevin's earlier embarrassment hardened into something more complex, reflection. The initial flush of shame cooled into a sober awareness that observation is not passive, but active, that to be looked at is to be measured, and that those measurements carry invisible tolls. I watched his shoulders slump with the dawning comprehension that the unease his colleagues had felt in his presence was not born of malice but of accumulation. The small weight of glances repeated until they became stones. By late afternoon, when he returned to my office at my request, his expression bore not the desperation of the morning, but the exhaustion of someone who had glimpsed a reality far heavier than expected. He sank into the chair, no longer fidgeting, no longer protesting. Instead, he sat quietly, as though the silence itself was now his confession. "Well?" I prompted softly. He looked down at his hands, folded tightly in his lap. "I didn't realize," he murmured. "I didn't realize how much every look matters. I thought if I wasn't saying anything wrong, I couldn't be doing anything wrong. But today, every glance felt like it cut into me, and it was just one day." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and in that fracture lay the first seed of change. I leaned back, allowing the silence once more to shape the moment. Then I spoke. "Empathy begins where assumption ends, Kevin. You have taken the first step. The question now is whether you will continue walking." He lifted his eyes then, and for the first time they held not defensiveness, not shame, but something resembling humility. And humility, when paired with reflection, can become growth. The remainder of the day unfolded in a rhythm that was unfamiliar to Kevin, yet it was precisely the kind of rhythm that fosters reflection. Each interaction, each task, every ordinary corporate obligation took on new layers of meaning as he navigated the office in attire that forced his awareness outward. He typed reports with heightened attention, conscious now not only of deadlines, but of the proximity of colleagues, the unspoken expectations conveyed through posture and glance, the subtle power dynamics that permeate even the most mundane tasks. He moved through meetings with deliberate caution, noting not the content of conversations alone, but the tone, cadence, and gestures of those around him. The exercise was rigorous, not because it demanded endurance, but because it demanded introspection, an unflinching confrontation with the consequences of prior actions, previously unexamined habits, and the invisible toll they exacted on others. The lesson was immersive because it was real. The discomfort was genuine, and therein lay its efficacy. Throughout, I observed him quietly from my vantage point, allowing moments of solitary awareness to solidify the impressions. Learning, especially of the type I had prescribed, cannot be taught through words alone. It requires situational immersion. The shifts in his posture, the fleeting expressions of hesitation or internal calculation, even the occasional stifled exhale of relief or frustration, all indicated progress. Kevin was beginning to internalize a truth that many never truly grasp, that professionalism is as much about perception, influence, and empathy as it is about tasks completed or objectives met. He understood, if only dimly at first, that to exist within the corporate ecosystem requires constant vigilance over one's own conduct, that respect cannot be assumed, that boundaries, though invisible, are non-negotiable and deeply consequential. By mid-afternoon, as the office began to quiet in preparation for the day's end, I summoned him to my office once more. The movement was purposeful, a ritual of closure, and he entered with a measured deference that had gradually replaced the earlier fear-induced rigidity. I gestured for him to sit and observed without comment as he took the chair, noting the small changes. His shoulders less tense, his hands no longer gripping, his eyes, though careful, carrying a trace of reflection rather than panic. "Kevin," I began, my tone smooth, measured, carrying the weight of authority tempered with encouragement. "Today you have engaged fully with an experience that few are ever asked to undertake. It was not easy. It required courage of a different sort, courage to confront, to endure, to reflect. What have you learned?" His response was slow at first, as though each word had to pass through layers of cognition and introspection. I I've learned that what may seem insignificant to me can carry immense weight for others, that even unintentional actions have consequences, that empathy is not abstract, it is felt, embodied, and practiced, and that awareness alone is not enough. It must inform behavior, guide interactions, and shape decisions. His voice grew steadier with each sentence, gaining clarity as understanding took root. There was a sincerity to the words, a nascent recognition that personal accountability extends beyond mere compliance with written rules. It encompasses an ongoing attentiveness to the experience of others, the subtle dynamics of shared space, and the profound impact of even a glance or gesture left unchecked. I allowed a measured pause, letting the import of his words settle, both for him and within the room itself, and then spoke again. Exactly. The true purpose of today was not to induce discomfort for its own sake, nor to perform some arbitrary exercise of authority. It was to illuminate the gap between intention and perception, to translate abstract policy into lived understanding. Your response today demonstrates not only compliance but comprehension, which is the cornerstone of professional integrity. I rose from my chair slowly, allowing the movement to punctuate the lesson, and walked around my desk to position myself directly in front of him, not in confrontation, but in presence. What remains now is integration. You must carry the awareness beyond the structured exercise, beyond the hours we have shared. Every interaction, every observation, every decision is an opportunity to practice the sensitivity you have begun to develop today. Kevin's gaze lifted fully this time, meeting mine with a steadiness that had been absent in the morning. There was no theatrical bravado, no forced composure, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had encountered a truth previously invisible, and that the weight of that encounter was neither punitive nor transient. It was foundational. "I understand," he said simply, the words infused with a new gravity, a recognition that the exercise was both an ending and a beginning. "I understand the responsibility I carry, and I will not forget the lesson." The office outside had quieted further, the hum of computers and faint murmur of conversations reduced to an ambient backdrop. I returned to my chair and gestured for him to remain standing, giving him the dignity of composure while reinforcing the gravity of the moment. "Kevin, progress is not measured in perfection. It is measured in recognition, reflection, and the consistent application of insight to behavior. You have demonstrated the first and most critical step. How you proceed from here will define not only your professional reputation, but your contribution to the culture of this organization. Remember, authority and respect are earned not through compliance alone, but through the thoughtful practice of empathy, awareness, and integrity." He nodded, the gesture deliberate and unforced, a mirror of the shift within him. There was relief, yes, but also determination, the kind that comes from having confronted personal limitation and emerged with a newfound clarity. The garments, once instruments of guidance and discomfort, now symbolized awareness, accountability, and the tangible embodiment of lessons internalized. The experience had been immersive, and the imprint of its lesson indelible. As he turned to leave, the careful steps he took were no longer hesitant or defensive. There remained a faint awareness of the garment's influence, a subtle attention to posture and movement, but it was coupled now with a conscious engagement rather than reluctant compliance. The office, which had once seemed an arena of scrutiny and exposure, now felt like a field of practice, a landscape where observation met thoughtful action, where awareness became habit and empathy became principle. After the door closed behind him, I remained seated, reflecting on the day's proceedings. There was satisfaction in the knowledge that the exercise had been successful, not because it had embarrassed or punished, but because it had elicited understanding, reflection, and the beginnings of sustainable behavioral change. The role of leadership is often mischaracterized as control or enforcement, but its highest function is to cultivate insight, to guide growth, and to translate abstract ideals into lived practice. Today had been a testament to that truth. I allowed myself a moment to savor the quiet, the subtle resonance of accomplishment, and then turned my gaze toward the panoramic view of the city stretching beyond my office window. The skyline shimmered with fading light, a mosaic of possibility and responsibility, a metaphor for the intricate balance of authority and stewardship that defines any professional environment. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not only the city, but the measure of my own role within it, a reminder that leadership is exercised not merely through policy, but through example, empathy, and unwavering commitment to principle. Kevin's experience would endure far longer than today's hours. It would inform decisions, interactions, and perspectives, quietly shaping the subtle contours of his professional conduct and perhaps influencing those around him. And while he might forget the specifics of fabric, posture, or footwear, he would not forget the lesson's essence. That perception matters as profoundly as intention, that every individual carries a unique experience of the shared environment, and that empathy, once internalized, becomes the guiding principle of professional excellence. As the office lights dimmed and the city's illumination deepened, I sat back in my chair, a quiet smile of satisfaction settling across my features. The exercise was complete, its objectives achieved. Kevin had confronted his own habits, experienced the consequences, and emerged with awareness, a transformation subtle yet enduring. And in that, the delicate balance of authority, insight, and compassion had been realized, a reminder that the most powerful lessons are those lived rather than merely instructed, and that the work of leadership at its finest is both art and responsibility, executed with care, precision, and unwavering dedication to human growth. The day ended, but its impact would ripple forward. Each choice, each glance, each decision henceforth would carry the echo of the lesson. And in that quiet awareness, both teacher and student had advanced, not through coercion or spectacle, but through a deliberate, immersive journey of understanding, reflection, and enduring professional empathy.